We were on day 4 of a week-long trek, aiming to explore an untouched, isolated stretch of wilderness. It had been Danny's idea to venture off the main trail and head into a restricted wilderness preserve area, a place where the maps showed only shaded regions with vague markers of mountain ridges, rivers, and dense forests. It was the kind of adventure you plan for once in a lifetime, promising a true escape from the chaos of daily life. The idea of isolation had thrilled us all at first. No cell service, no people, just raw, unspoiled nature. But as the days went on, that excitement started to morph into an unspoken tension. There was something unsettling about being so far from civilization. The sun was sinking lower in the sky. We had hiked a good 10 miles, our packs feeling heavier with each step, and by the time we found a clearing just below the ridge, we were more than ready to set up camp. The spot was nearly perfect, giving us a full view of the valley below and the forest stretching out beyond. It was quiet and peaceful. We set up our tents and settled in for the night, sitting around the fire. We were laughing, relaxing around the fire, letting the day's hike melt away. Just as the sky turned from a warm amber to a darker shade, Danny suddenly paused, looking up toward the ridge above us. "Hey, check it out," he said, nodding upward. We followed his gaze, and my stomach tightened at the sight. A dark figure was standing at the top of the ridge, silhouetted against the sunset, just watching us. They were too far to make out any details, but they were close enough to feel unnerving, just standing there, unmoving. "Do you think they're camping up there?" I asked. Something about the figure didn't sit right with me. "Could be," Zoe muttered. "But why just stand there? They've been watching us for a while." Danny shrugged, but I could tell he felt it too. That strange weight in the air, like we'd somehow broken some kind of unspoken rule by camping here. As we kept an eye on the ridge, the figure stood motionless, barely shifting, as though they didn't want us to know we'd been spotted. Finally, as the light started to fade completely, the figure turned and slowly disappeared into the darkening forest. We exhaled almost in unison, and Danny tried to laugh it off, but I noticed he kept looking over his shoulder as he stoked the fire. "Guess they weren't looking for company," Danny said, though his voice lacked its usual lightness. The night crept in quickly, bringing with it a chill that seeped through our jackets. Despite the crackling fire, the clearing felt strangely empty, like the laughter and stories didn't reach beyond our circle of light. I kept looking back at the ridge, expecting to see the figure return, watching us from the shadows. But the ridge stayed dark, its peaks swallowed by the night sky. As the fire died down, we decided to call it a night. Danny doused the last embers, and we each crawled into our tents. I lay there for a while, listening to the soft sounds of nature, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling from earlier. The night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Then I heard a faint clattering, like little rocks rolling down the ridge. It started softly, a few small stones tumbling here and there, but then it grew louder, like someone was deliberately dislodging rocks, letting them tumble down toward our camp. I sat up. Each rock seemed to fall with purpose, landing just near enough to make us notice, but never close enough to be a real threat. I unzipped my tent and peered out into the dark, meeting Zoe's wide-eyed stare. She'd heard it too. "You're hearing that, right?" I whispered. She looked up at the ridge. "Someone's up there." Danny poked his head out from his tent, eyes squinting in the dim light. "It's probably just some loose rocks," he mumbled, though he didn't sound convinced. But the rocks kept coming, each one landing just close enough to feel deliberate. I didn't want to admit it, but it felt like a warning. Danny, always the brave one, grabbed his flashlight and stood up. "I'm going to see what's up there. Can't sleep with all this racket anyway." Zoe and I exchanged a look, but didn't argue. We watched as Danny started up the narrow path that led to the ridge, the beam of his flashlight bobbing as he climbed. He called out a couple of times, but there was no response. As he neared the top, the figure suddenly appeared again, just for a split second, barely illuminated by the edge of his flashlight, and then, just as quickly, it vanished, blending into the shadows. Danny turned and made his way back down, visibly rattled. "Anything?" I asked, though I could tell by his face that he hadn't found what he was looking for. He shook his head, looking back over his shoulder. Nothing, but I swear, something's up there. I saw someone, just watching. As he spoke, another rock tumbled down from the ridge, this one landing right at his feet. We all went silent, staring up at the ridge, expecting the figure to step out of the shadows again, but the ridge was empty, shrouded in darkness. We huddled around the fire pit, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but hiking out in the dark wasn't exactly appealing either. Then we heard a faint voice, carried on the wind like a whisper floating down from the ridge. It was too soft to make out words, like it was meant for us, but didn't want us to understand. The voice faded, but the uneasy feeling it left stayed. "We need to get out of here," Zoe finally said. Danny nodded, his bravado from earlier completely gone. We quickly packed up our gear. Every so often I'd look up, expecting to see the figure looming over us, ready to strike, but the ridge remained empty. As we started down the trail, the sense of being watched grew stronger. It felt like we were disturbing something that didn't want to be disturbed. I kept looking back, my nerves frayed, convinced that any moment I'd see the figure following us. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crash echoed through the forest. A boulder, bigger than any of the rocks from earlier, tumbling down the ridge, landing with a thunderous thud just behind us. We froze, staring at the boulder, realization dawning on us that it could have been meant to hit us. We didn't waste another second. We ran, our flashlights bobbing wildly as we stumbled down the trail. I could feel the presence behind us, a looming shadow, relentless and silent. By the time we realized we were lost, we'd already been stumbling through the dark forest for hours. The trail had disappeared behind us, swallowed up by the endless expanse of trees, each one looking more like the last. In the deep silence of the night, only our hurried breaths and our own footsteps broke the oppressive stillness. Every time we stopped to regain our bearings, we felt it, a presence lingering just out of sight. We didn't know where to go, but we knew we had to keep moving. Stopping wasn't an option. The night stretched on, and with each step, our legs grew weaker, our minds more frayed. We were exhausted, our water running low, our stomachs gnawing with hunger, but none of us dared to suggest stopping to rest or eat. The forest had taken on a sinister stillness, and each snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made us quicken our pace, too afraid to linger. By dawn, the ridge was long out of sight, replaced by dense underbrush and towering pines that seemed to close in on us from every direction. The sun's rays barely penetrated the canopy, casting strange shadows that danced and twisted as we moved. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I'd catch a glimpse of something in the distance, a shadowy figure moving just behind us, as if herding us deeper into the woods. We barely slept that first night, each of us taking turns to keep watch. But the weight of exhaustion pressed down on us, blurring our senses and warping our thoughts. I remember waking up to a faint whisper, only to realize that both Zoe and Danny were wide awake, sitting in silence, their eyes fixed on the dark forest around us. None of us spoke about it, but we all knew that whisper hadn't come from any of us. On the second day, we were lost. Hunger clawed at us, making our heads spin and our steps unsteady. We tried to eat, but the forest was so quiet each bite seemed to echo. Every now and then, we'd hear footsteps that weren't ours, trailing us. We never saw anyone, but the sounds followed us everywhere, haunting us like a ghost. As the sun began to set on that second day, panic set in. We didn't know where we were, and every path we took seemed to lead us back to the same grove of trees. At nightfall, the forest came alive again with sounds, whispers, rustling leaves, branches creaking as if under the weight of something moving just out of sight. We clung together, barely able to speak as we trudged forward. I don't know how long we wandered like that, but just when I thought my legs would give out, I saw a glimmer of hope, a faint shimmer of headlights through the trees. Our car was parked exactly where we'd left it, half covered in fallen leaves and twigs, as if it had been waiting for us. We stumbled out of the trees and practically fell against the car, slinging our packs off and collapsing against the doors. It was only when we were inside, doors locked and engine running, that we allowed ourselves to breathe again. None of us spoke as we drove back, our eyes fixed straight ahead, too shaken to look back. It took 2 days to find our way back to that car, and in all that time, I'm certain we weren't alone. Whatever we'd seen on that ridge hadn't wanted us there, and in those 2 days, we were nothing more than trespassers, prey in a forest with rules we hadn't understood. Back home, it took us a few weeks to recover. We were a little dehydrated and lacking in vitamins, but we were glad to be safe and at home. That was 2 years ago, and I still haven't returned hiking. Going out on solo hikes was kind of my thing. My friends used to say it wasn't safe to go alone, but for me, it was the best way to clear my head. Just me, the trail, and the sounds of nature. No distractions, no noise. My life was so hectic, and getting away felt like hitting the reset button. Late October had always been my favorite time of year to go. The trails were emptier, the air was cool, and the leaves had turned vibrant shades of orange, red, and yellow. This time, though, it was different. I didn't realize it yet, but I wouldn't be going back to those trails again. The plan was 3 days out in the woods, just me and my gear. I'd picked a trail recommended by a friend, one that was supposedly quiet and lightly traveled. The perfect place to unwind. I packed light but made sure to have everything I needed. A tent, some freeze-dried meals, water, a small flashlight, and a few basic tools. Nothing fancy. This was a simple, peaceful getaway, and I wanted to keep it that way. The first day was exactly as I'd imagined. Peaceful, calm. I didn't pass a single person. Birds were chirping, squirrels darted through the underbrush, and the sun cast a warm, golden glow through the leaves. It felt like I had the whole forest to myself. As the day wore on, I found a small clearing just as the sun began to set. I set up my tent, boiled some water for my meal, and settled in as the night wrapped around me. I lay in my tent, listening to the gentle rustle of leaves. I was almost asleep when I heard a faint crack like a twig snapping. Then another. The sound was too intentional to be an animal. I went still, trying to catch any sound. After a few moments, it stopped. Just when I'd convinced myself it was probably just some deer passing through, I unzipped the tent flap ever so slightly, peering out into the dim, moonlit clearing. And there he was. A man stood at the edge of the trees, partially cloaked in the dark. His clothes were filthy, torn in places, and he looked like he hadn't seen a shower in months. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and dark, fixed right on me, unblinking. He didn't move or make a sound, just stared, like he was studying me from the darkness. I wanted to speak, ask if he needed help or something, but the words wouldn't come out. My heart was hammering as I lay there, frozen in place, trying to make sense of this eerie figure in the middle of the forest. He tilted his head slightly, then, without a sound, backed into the trees and disappeared. I zipped the tent up quickly, praying that he was gone for good, even though the snapping twigs and heavy quiet of the forest told me otherwise. The morning came, and I shook off the feeling from the night before. Daylight had a way of making everything seem normal, even though I couldn't quite shake a sense of unease. I packed up my gear and set off on the trail, covering more ground than I'd expected. By late afternoon, I was feeling the burn in my legs, a good kind of tired. I found another spot to set up camp, this time by a small stream. The sound of the water trickling over rocks was soothing, a kind of natural white noise. I spent a while sitting by the stream, watching the water flow. As the light faded, I set up my tent and got a fire going, warming myself as the temperature dropped. I cooked my meal, sat back, and watched the stars appear overhead. I even thought about how grateful I was for moments like these. But that night, the feeling came back, stronger this time. I lay in my tent, staring up at the nylon ceiling, feeling like I was being watched. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the darkness and my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I drifted into a light sleep, a sound pulled me back into wakefulness, a soft crunch outside my tent, footsteps moving slowly. Circling my tent, I held my breath, gripping my flashlight but not daring to turn it on. Every instinct told me to stay still, to not make a sound. The footsteps stopped, just on the other side of the tent wall. I waited, tense and motionless. After a while, the steps faded into the woods, leaving me alone with the silence and the lingering feeling that I wasn't really alone. I don't know how I managed to sleep after that, but somehow I did. When I woke up, the sun was already filtering through the trees, and the world felt normal again. Almost. I packed up camp, quick this time, and started down the trail. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd look over my shoulder, expecting to see someone. But there was never anything there, just shadows and trees. As I walked, I found myself picking up the pace. I wasn't really enjoying the hike anymore, wasn't feeling the peace I'd come out here to find. My senses were heightened, my nerves on edge. About an hour into my hike, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, moving between the trees, keeping pace with me but staying just out of sight. I stopped, squinting into the forest, but when I looked directly at the spot, there was nothing there. Just trees, shadows, and the sound of the wind in the leaves. I started walking again, faster this time, hoping that if I just kept moving, whatever, or whoever, was following me would give up. But no matter how fast I went, the feeling stayed with me. It felt like the forest was pressing in on me. I couldn't shake the sense of being hunted, as if something was tracking me, waiting for me to let my guard down. The sun was setting, and I knew I needed to find a place to camp for the night. But the thought of stopping, of setting up my tent and being vulnerable, filled me with a sense of dread. I found a small rock outcropping and decided it was as good a place as any. I set up camp quickly, keeping my flashlight within reach and listening to every sound, every rustle in the underbrush. I sat by my tent, watching the darkness settle over the forest, feeling like a trapped animal. The silence was unsettling. As I sat there, I saw it again. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. I squinted, trying to make out any details, but it was too far, shrouded in shadow. I thought about calling out, but something stopped me. Instinct, maybe, or just plain fear. The figure took a step back, then disappeared into the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction where I'd seen him, but the light just cut through empty air, illuminating nothing but trees. I knew then that I couldn't stay there. I grabbed my gear, not bothering to pack it properly, and started down the trail. I didn't care that it was dark, didn't care that I might get lost. All I wanted was to get as far away as I could from that thing, that person, whatever it was. The trail was barely visible, the moon providing only a faint glow through the canopy. I walked as fast as I could, my eyes darting around, my ears straining to pick up any hint of movement. And then I heard footsteps behind me, unhurried, like someone knew I had nowhere to go. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, quickening my pace. The footsteps matched my speed, staying just behind me, close enough that I could hear each crunch of leaves, each snap of a twig. I felt trapped, as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep me there, to keep me from ever leaving. Finally, after what felt like ages, I saw a faint light ahead, the parking lot. I stumbled toward it, my legs aching, my lungs burning. As I broke through the trees, I chanced one last look over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing there at the edge of the forest. But there was nothing, just the silent trees, watching as I fled. I threw my gear into the car, climbed in and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I couldn't help but look in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that figure standing at the edge of the forest. But there was nothing, just darkness stretching out behind me, following me all the way home. After that experience, I stayed away from hiking for a while. Even months later, when I finally got back out there, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in a tent anymore. I've hiked alone more times than I can count. It's my escape, a break from the noise of the world. I prefer the less traveled trails, the ones where you're more likely to encounter a deer than another person. It was late October, and the crisp autumn air had settled in nicely. Ideal weather for a 3-day trek along a trail I'd never tried before. I was about 12 miles in on the first day when I saw him, sitting on a fallen log off to the side of the path, as if he were waiting. He was older than me by a couple of decades, probably in his 50s, with unkempt graying hair and an old, fraying jacket. He looked up as I passed, and his eyes met mine with a sort of quiet intensity. "Hey," he called out. You wouldn't happen to know these woods, would you? I stopped, more out of politeness than anything, and shook my head. No, first time out here, I replied. He scratched at his neck as if in thought. I've misplaced my camp, he admitted. Went out to collect firewood, and when I turned around, I couldn't find my way back. I looked around, but there was nothing. Just trees and more trees stretching endlessly in every direction. All right, I said. I can help you look. Where'd you last see it? He gestured vaguely behind him in a direction I hadn't come from. Back that way, I think. We set off together, and as we walked, he told me he'd been out there a couple of days already, though he'd run out of food the night before. I offered him a granola bar from my pack, which he took gratefully, tearing it open and devouring it like he hadn't eaten in days. We walked for a while, maybe an hour, in near silence. The farther we went, the thicker the trees seemed to grow, blocking out much of the afternoon sunlight. The path was rough, but I kept telling myself he knew his way, that he'd remember something soon. But eventually it became clear he was just as lost as I was. We hadn't seen any hint of a camp. I couldn't even see where we'd come from anymore, just a blur of endless forest. Are you sure it's this way? I asked him. He scratched his head, looking around almost absently. I could have sworn it was. His words trailed off as if he'd forgotten what he was saying. That's when I started feeling the unease. Something about him seemed off. Not dangerous exactly, but his behavior was strange. It felt like he didn't want to find his camp, that he just wanted to keep moving deeper into the forest. Look, I finally said, stopping to catch my breath. I think we're going in circles. Maybe we should turn back. He didn't respond, just stared at me, his eyes distant and unfocused. It was like he hadn't even heard me. Hey, I repeated, a bit more forcefully. He blinked, snapping out of whatever daze he'd been in. Sorry, he mumbled. Guess I got a bit turned around. By then, the sun was sinking low. I had no interest in wandering around with him all night, so I made up my mind. Look, I really need to get back on track, I told him. If you're still lost by tomorrow, maybe we can run into each other again. But I need to head back. As I turned to go, I felt his hand grip my shoulder, firm enough to stop me in my tracks. Wait, he said, his voice tense. Please, just a little longer. It has to be here, somewhere. I hesitated, sensing his desperation, but everything in me was screaming to leave. I really have to go, I stammered, trying to shake off his hand. His grip loosened, but he kept pace with me, shadowing my steps as I tried to find my way back to the main trail. But no matter where I turned, he followed, not saying a word, just there. His presence was suffocating, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I was starting to lose my sense of direction, but I couldn't bring myself to ask him for help. Something about his silence, his relentless following, kept me from speaking. Hours passed. The light was nearly gone, the trees dense and dark. I could feel my pulse quicken with each step, an itch of panic building at the base of my spine. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped and turned to face him, hoping to make some sense of what was happening, but he was gone. I looked around, my eyes straining in the fading light. He'd been right there, following me, his footsteps just behind mine. There was no way he could have disappeared without me noticing. I called out, "Hello? Where'd you go?" Only silence answered. Feeling unnerved, I hurried along what I hoped was the right path. But even as I walked, a feeling gnawed at me. The sense that he wasn't gone, that he was still there, hiding somewhere close. It took me hours to find my way back to the main trail. By the time I did, the moon was high. I barely stopped to catch my breath before I started back toward my original campsite. With each familiar landmark I passed, I felt a greater sense of relief. I was almost back when I heard a twig snapping somewhere close behind. I whipped around, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. Only the endless stretch of trees and shadows. But as I turned back, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing just a few yards away, watching me. It was him. "Hey," I called, my voice shaky but firm. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. For a split second, I considered walking toward him, confronting him, but a cold instinct held me back. I turned and walked away, keeping my pace steady, resisting the urge to run. But I knew he was following, matching my steps, his presence a dark weight pressing down on me. I made it back to my tent and zipped myself inside, telling myself I was safe, that there was no way he could get to me now. Hours passed, and I drifted in and out of an uneasy sleep. I dreamt of footsteps circling my tent, of eyes watching from the darkness, and every time I opened my eyes, I thought I saw a shadow outside, just beyond the tent's thin walls. When dawn finally broke, I packed up in record time. As I made my way down the trail, I kept my eyes down, refusing to look back. I thought about ending my trip right there and going back to my car, but there was no way I was going to ruin my trip just because of some crazy guy. Fortunately, I didn't run into him again and got to continue without any more trouble, though I couldn't fully relax after that encounter. It was hard to shake the feeling that I was still being watched, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more than once. On my last night as I was breaking camp, I found something at the edge of my sight that stopped me cold. A small pile of rocks stacked neatly together, the kind of marker I'd seen hikers leave on trails. Only this one was just there, a few feet from my tent. I broke that rock pile apart and left the forest. I don't hike alone anymore. It was supposed to be a simple weekend hike with friends. I'd been out with Danny, Laura, and Tom countless times before, always finding our way through trails, even in unpredictable weather. But this time, something was different. Something I can barely explain without sounding crazy. The trip began smoothly enough. We planned to hike up a familiar trail, setting up camp near the top for a couple of nights before looping back around. We checked the forecast before leaving, and everything seemed fine. But on the second day, just as we were making our way down, a sudden storm rolled in out of nowhere. The skies darkened, thunder crackled overhead, and in minutes we were caught in a downpour, soaked to the bone with no warning. The rain was relentless, almost like a wall of water crashing down. The trail that had been clear and well-worn when we started was now unrecognizable, muddied and washed over with debris. Trees that I swore were familiar now looked foreign. We tried to press on, but the storm forced us to stop, huddling together beneath a cluster of trees for shelter. We waited, hoping the downpour would pass, but it only grew stronger, and soon the air became thick with fog, rolling in from the trees and settling around us. "What are we going to do?" Laura asked. We could barely hear her over the rain. Danny pulled out his map, but it was soaked, the ink running and smudging, making it nearly impossible to read. We were disoriented, stranded in what felt like an endless maze of trees and fog. "We'll just follow the trail back," Tom said, though the uncertainty was plain on his face. But as we looked around, we realized we weren't even sure where the trail was anymore. After about 30 minutes, the storm finally began to let up and the rain tapered off into a light drizzle. The forest, though, looked like it had changed completely. Branches and leaves covered what little path we could see, and a creeping unease settled over us. As we started moving again, night began to fall. We pressed on, hoping to find some landmark, some sign that we were heading in the right direction. That's when we first saw her. Ahead of us on the trail, just beyond a bend in the path, stood a woman. She was wearing a long white dress, almost glowing in the dim light. She stood perfectly still, her back to us, facing deeper into the woods. "Who is that?" Laura whispered, clutching my arm. "No idea," I replied, feeling an odd mix of curiosity and dread. "Maybe she's lost too?" Danny called out. "Hey, are you all right?" But the woman didn't move, didn't even turn her head. She just stood there, silent and still. We approached cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last. The closer we got, the stranger it all seemed. Her dress was pristine, untouched by the mud and dirt that clung to all of us. And then there was her bare feet, standing on sharp stones and twigs without a hint of discomfort. When we were just a few yards away, she suddenly began to walk, moving slowly along the path. We called out again, but she ignored us, her pace steady and unhurried. "Maybe she didn't hear us," Tom said, though his voice was wavering. "We should follow her. Maybe she knows the way back." Reluctantly, we fell in line behind her, watching as she disappeared around a bend in the path. But when we reached the corner, she was gone. There were no side trails, no place she could have hidden, just an empty stretch of path winding into the darkness. Confused, we looked around, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Danny examined the ground, searching for footprints. There was nothing. Not a single trace that anyone had walked there. We just stood there, not saying anything, the intensity of what happened sinking in. The woods felt even darker, and I could feel an odd pressure. "Let's keep moving," I finally said, eager to put some distance between us and that spot. But as we walked, an eerie quiet followed us. No birds, no rustling animals, just our footsteps in the mud. That night, we set up camp in a small clearing, each of us too tired to discuss what we'd seen. We tried to settle in, but I kept replaying the scene over in my mind. The image of the woman in white burned into my memory. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of faint crying, soft and distant, like it was coming from somewhere deep in the woods. Danny, Tom, and Laura were all still in their tents, fast asleep. The crying continued, a gentle, mournful sound that sent a shiver through me. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside, scanning the dark trees surrounding us. Nothing. But the crying didn't stop. It almost felt like it was coming from everywhere at once, echoing off the trees, bouncing around the clearing. In the dim moonlight, I caught a glimpse of something at the edge of the clearing, a figure standing just beyond the circle of light from our campfire. It was her, the woman in white. I froze, watching as she stood there, unmoving, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond us. And then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she faded into the darkness, leaving me alone with the sound of her quiet sobs echoing through the trees. The next morning, I told the others what I'd seen, expecting them to brush it off, maybe even laugh. But to my surprise, Laura admitted that she'd heard the crying too. Danny and Tom didn't say anything, but for the first time since we'd started this trip, I saw real fear in their eyes. We packed up fast, determined to get away from that clearing as quickly as possible. But every now and then, we'd catch glimpses of white between the trees, only to find nothing when we looked directly. Hours passed, and the trail seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. It felt like we were walking in circles, always ending up back in the same spot. Desperation set in, and we started calling out, hoping someone would hear us. Finally, as dusk began to fall, we stumbled out onto a familiar path. Relief washed over us as we recognized a landmark, the fallen tree we'd passed on the way up. We followed the path back down, too exhausted and shaken to speak. We kept moving until we reached the place where we had left our car. We drove back in silence. No matter how we looked at it, we couldn't explain her. And I think I'll never be able to forget that mournful cry. If these stories gave you chills, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life horror. Got a creepy hiking experience of your own? Share it in the comments. We'd love to hear your spine-tingling tales. And remember, next time you hit the trails, stay alert, because in the wild, you never know what might be following. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.